Okay, welcome everybody. This is Nancy Sanchez. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator here at TPA. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm going to quickly go through a slide deck and then I'll turn this over to Rodrigo. Thank you to Wondry, who's our community building sponsor, for sponsoring our educational events. Some upcoming events for you to register if you haven't already. September 12th, we'll have Social Media for Podcasters 101. October 20th, we'll have How to Network in Podcasting and resources to tap into. We have some upcoming events that will be scheduled from October through December that are yet to hit our calendar, so be on the lookout for those. And if you're not a member of TPA or know somebody that isn't, feel free to join us using promo code TPA25 and receive 25% off your first year of membership. And if you're not following us on social media, please do so. Here are all our social media handles. And that's it for me. And I will stop sharing and turn it over to Rodrigo.
Thank you, Nancy.
Did I stop sharing my screen? It looks like it on my end.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'll start sharing mine. I have some slides here. Okay, so thank you for joining and welcome to this webinar about Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. What we will talk today is about how to make a true crime hit in Latin America. We will discuss how we built this documentary series and the results we got from after publishing it. I'm from Mexico. I will introduce myself in a little bit, but English is not my native language, so bear with me with my pronunciation. Okay, so I'll start sharing. As I said, first, let me introduce myself. I'm Rodrigo Crespo. I'm a Mexican storyteller, editor, and producer passionate about telling nonfiction stories. I was the managing and story editor of Humo. So that's why I'm talking about this phenomenal series we built here at Sonoro. And let me talk to you a little bit about Sonoro. We are a global entertainment company with offices in LA, New York, Miami, and Mexico City. Right now, Sonoro is the #1 Spanish podcast network in the world, and we are creating world-class content in English, Spanish, and Spanglish. We create immersive audio experiences with award-winning and industry-recognized fiction series like Toxicomania, starring and co-produced by Luis Gerardo Méndez, Princess of South Beach with Rachel Zegler, as well as documentary series that portray Latin America reality. And today, we'll talk about one of those documentary series. We'll talk about Humo, Murder and Silence in El Salvador. This podcast series was produced from 2021, so it took a couple of years to get it done, and it was possible because it had a big team behind it. Here's a little bit of the team behind Humo. Some people are in the picture, some others not. But Brian Avelar was our lead reporter and host. Fernando Estrada and Sara Mota, our producers. Mane Parra, Fernando Galaviz, our sound engineers. Jasmine Romero was also the story editor and one of the development executives. And just so you get an idea of how difficult and how complex was to build this podcast series, more than 30 people work on Humo, from people in podcasting, journalists, marketing specialists. A lot of people work on it. This series was also possible because we made a partnership with Revista Factum, a digital news outlet in El Salvador. And that's one of the key things I want to talk about from the start. This was possible because we partner with local reporters and local media news outlet. In many cases, in nonfiction stories, I believe that's one of the keys to get involved with people on the ground and people who really know the reality we want to talk about. So Brian Avelar was a key part of the team, and we will talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But partnering with Revista Factum was really important, and in total we have like around 8 journalists from El Salvador, Mexico, and the United States reporting for this story. So that's just to get an idea of how many people work behind this story. If you haven't heard our podcast, I recommend to do so, but I will share a little glimpse about it. Humo is an investigation into a serial killer that ended up revealing the crisis of violence and human rights in El Salvador. Our starting point was to investigate a serial killer. And this is how a story begins. It begins with this scene. A young woman and her mother were murdered on a night in 2021, but their screams alerted the neighbors. After many 911 calls, the police found the killer at his home several hours later. This is a photograph of the serial killer's house. And over the next few days, authorities reported between 8 and 40 bodies buried in the backyard of that house. Until this day, there's not an official figure of bodies found in that backyard, and I will talk a little bit about that and kind of the problems we have when we were building this story. Here's a photograph of the backyard. That's where allegedly there were between more than 30 bodies. As I said, we don't know the official number, but there were a lot of bodies buried there. And this scene is the classical way to start a true crime podcast. But and that's the main topic of this webinar. Why is it different to create a true crime series in Latin America? First of all, context is key. Let me tell you about this context. Some countries in the region have topped the list of homicides worldwide in recent decades, and disappearances are not far behind. El Salvador recently topped both those lists for several years. Added to this is the ineffectiveness of the government authorities in solving crimes. In El Salvador, the impunity rate reached 97%. This means that only 3 out of every 100 homicides had a conviction. So impunity is very high, and violence is an open wound in our communities. If you do a little research on the story of Latin America in the last 70 years, you can go as far or as near as the coup d'etat in Latin America in the 60s and the 70s, to all the news headlines right now in Mexico about violence generated by drug cartels. So talking about these subjects in a serious manner needs a lot of empathy. That was one of the key motives of telling this story, how to tell a story about violence, a story about murder with empathy, and not just being like most true crimes that focus on the headlines of the crimes. So that leaves us with one big question: how to tell our story in these violent realities. So I was saying, most true crimes have a similar angle. If you watch series like Mindhunter, that it's a fiction, or a documentary like The Keepers, or listen to podcasts like Serial, they have like one or two main angles to understand the perpetrator, the criminal psyche, or to find out who committed the crime. That's the main focus on most of true crimes that you watch and listen mostly all the time, and they are great, but we wanted to make something different. And the first step to do in order to do that was changing the POV. What it means is the victims, through the voice of the relatives, will be the protagonists. We want to tell the stories of the people that were murdered, that have been disappeared, or that are suffering for human rights violations in El Salvador. So that was like the main guideline in order to tell this story. And this was not like we have an eureka moment or like we discuss it a lot, but there was one scene that made us realize why it was so important. It's a key moment, and let me go back to from the beginning where I told you about the importance of partnering with local reporters and with local news media outlets. Brian Avelar was reporting the clandestine grave in Chalchuapa. And while he was documenting all their stories, Brian saw relatives of the disappeared arriving with photos of their daughters and sons. They were searching. Obviously, they were sad, they were worried, but there was a feeling that we did not expect to find out in that strong way. They were carrying hope. They were trying to find their loved ones. So our mission was to honor that hope, but by getting to know the victims through their loved ones, listen to these stories of violence from those who suffer it, and not from those who perpetrate it. Uh, we mostly listen to the criminals and why they did or did not some things, but that was not our focus. Our focus were uh, people like this woman that was carrying a T-shirt with the son with the photo of his son looking with hope, and that's harder than it sounds because we also didn't want to make a story so painful that people didn't want to keep listening to our podcast series. Um, so one of our first challenges was to hook the listener and to keep them in the story. That's always difficult for all storytellers. I'm not telling like anything new here, but keeping our audience engaged, it's a key part of our work. And when you are listening stories that all the time are making you feel angry or sad, or it's difficult to keep going. Just open any newspaper today, and it's difficult to follow through all these difficult stories. That was a common obstacle. But then we have different obstacles because reality in El Salvador also became an obstacle to tell this story. And also, I'm not telling any new thing for documentarians, but all journalistic reporting, all documentaries face different obstacles. I will talk about the four main ones that we faced through our investigation. The first one was government censorship. From the start, one of the reasons we wanted to tell this story was because Revista Factum published the confession of the criminal, and that article that was written also by Brian Avelar, published by Revista Factum, was censored by the government of Nayib Bukele. That was kind of new in El Salvador. It's not that it doesn't exist, but the way it was done was new because it was through the judicial system. So that was a thing that was an obstacle for us. And again, a little bit of context for people who don't know a lot about the reality of Latin America. Access to government information in the region is complicated in many countries. Some establish long and complicated processes to discourage people to seeking information. That's the case, for example, in Mexico. And in other cases, that access don't even exist. So information that contradicts the government versions is censored in many different ways. And that was a thing that was starting at that time in El Salvador. The second one, and we find this one during our reporting, is that Nayib Bukele made a secret deal with gangs. Um, I hope this is well known in most countries, especially in the US. But yeah, he made a deal. There was a deal between the government and criminals. Um this we knew thanks to El Faro, one of the most important digital media in El Salvador. they revealed that Bukele government had agreed to a truce with gangs to reduce the number of homicides. At the moment where we were investigating the serial killer and the disappearances, we knew that disappearances were on the rise in El Salvador, but there was not a concrete fact that explained why it was the case. So this deal with the gangs and the government was the case. The homicides kept going. It didn't disappear, the violence, but they were hiding the violence. So there was a lot of people disappearing in El Salvador. The third one is the seat of a dictatorship that was present during our investigation. In the months and a little bit more than a year that we were researching and writing this story, Nayib Bukele gained control of Congress in midterm elections and dismissed the Supreme Court, appointing new judges close to him. So that's why it was also difficult to try to fight back the censorship, because it was from the judicial system that was eventually controlled by Nayib Bukele. And the last one, and probably the most important, freedom of the press was at risk at the moment in El Salvador. Brian Avelar, our lead reporter, became a protagonist of this story due to the political violence of Bukele's government. Some months into our investigation, a government official close to Bukele declared that Brian Brothers was a gang member. And let me do some fact share. You can also listen in the podcast series. Brian doesn't even have brothers, but because of the growing censorship and the power grab by Bukele, Brian could be arrested at any moment. And a little bit of context also here, if you let me. Salvador, from that time to this day, lives in a thing called state of exception. This is like the cancellation of individual guarantees, and it means among other things that police is free to arrest people simply by suspecting they were gang members. So a government official telling that Brian was related to a gang was enough evidence from their point of view to arrest him. So he fled El Salvador in 2022 during our investigation. So obviously that complicated, and today he hasn't left El Salvador, and this year more activists and more journalists have fled El Salvador because of Nayib Bukele's regime. So we lost our lead reporter on the ground, and we find our host in the worst possible way. At the moment, Brian went from being the journalist or one of the lead journalists of this story to the narrator, and unfortunately, another victim of this story. And that's not an easy task, because unlike other journalistic schools in Latin America, journalists prefer not to be protagonists to their stories. So we have to convince Brian to be a key character, to be the host of this story. After a couple of tries, we managed that, and we're more than happy that we did it, because it gives the story another personal level that we probably couldn't have accomplished without Brian taking that role. It was unfortunate the way it happened, but it was. I think it was a very good thing for the story, even if that seems like a little bit crazy. So that was the last piece for our kind of puzzle we needed to solve in order to tell this story. So I talk a little bit about, we wanted to change the POV. We wanted to talk about the victims, their stories, and we want to talk also about the reality of El Salvador. So how did we solve this puzzle that seems a lot different than a classical true crime? Well, we use some key narrative pieces of true crimes through the 8 episodes, even though the protagonists change all the time. And those key elements of true crimes that were like the base of how we did this podcast series is we have a crime, we have a victim, and we have a perpetrator. This was repeated through the whole series, even though the characters uh, change during the 8 episodes. The other big creative concept that we use was mixing different movies and TV genres, and not just true crimes like The Serial or The Keepers. We use these kind of structures and elements and tones to tell this story. For example, the political thriller. One of the series that was a reference was House of Cards, um, because it was really relevant for us to talk about Najib Bukele, and he, like Francis Underwood, took all the power through secret pacts with gangs, radical speeches to his political base, and political maneuvers like firing all the supreme judges at the same time. So the political thriller was a key genre that we used to build this story, to write this story, and to also like design in sound wise this story. And the second one was the journalistic thriller, with films that probably most of us journalists and documentarians love, like The Post and Spotlight, because it was very important to tell our audience how the journalistic work was done in a context of censorship and political persecution. Um, it's not common, as I said, for journalists to become the protagonists of their stories, but it was our case. It was the case of Brian, so we needed to get how these stories can be told in an engaging way. So, using these key elements of true crime plus a point of view focus on the victim's stories and adding the use of other genres to our advantage, that was kind of in a big creative concept, the recipe we used to build and create the narrative structure of Humo. So I will go. We structure our 8 episode series in kind of 3 acts uh, to accomplish that. The first act was the clandestine grave of Chalchuapa. That's the most true crime classic way of telling a story, and that was our way of opening this story to the people, like a specific crime, a specific moment in time uh, where a crime happened, and we used like these 3 key elements of a true crime. We have the victims, Jacqueline, Mirna, Alexis, and Rina. They were all murdered in 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 that house in Chalchuapa, and their stories were told through their relatives. We talked with friends, family members of Jacqueline, Mirna, and Alexis, and also we talked with Rina's mother. So they were telling their story, their personal story, and also the story of the crime. Um, the crime was between 8 and 40 people were murdered and clandestine buried in the killer's backyard, and the perpetrator was Hugo Osorio, known as the Chachapa killer. We also did a little bit of investigation about the perpetrator. We had the confession, but we didn't like. And for us, an easy way to tell this story was like just exploiting the confession and telling all the awful things he says in that confession. But for us, that's not the way to tell the story of a victim, especially in a context of violence. But we dig a little bit on Hugo Osorio. We talk with people close to him. So if you listen the first episodes, you will find a little bit about Hugo Osorio, but he's not the main character in any shape or form. Those are like the first episodes. Then we get to our second act, that it's Najib Bukele power grab. If you see it just in the slides, it doesn't help the quality and the complexity of how our podcast series is written, because it seems like just structure, but it's just to simplify a little bit things. Um, the episodes 4 through 6, we still keep talking about victims of disappearances, but the main topic here is how Nayib Bukele became with all the power in El Salvador. The victims here are the Salvadoran society, political dissidents, and human rights activists, alongside the families of the disappeared. Uh, the crimes here are multiple, but two of the main ones are making pacts with gangs and the political violence that Nayib Bukele started to exercise in El Salvador, such as entering into the Salvadoran Congress with soldiers in order to fully control all branches of the government. So, and the perpetrators are Nayib Bukele, the Mara Salvatrucha, and Barrio 18 gangs. Here is also in these 3 episodes is an explanation of the context of the violence in El Salvador. We can't tell this story without the importance of the gangs and how the violence they established in El Salvador were so was so difficult to live by. Just to give you a glimpse of that, there were some neighbors where you can't cross to the other sidewalk because it was controlled by the opposing gang. That's how difficult it was to live in El Salvador when the gangs control the country. But they did a pact with the government. And this is the place where you can find most of the House of Cards things, the political thriller things, uh, because we wanted to tell this story and focus on the scenes, the actions, and not just telling who Nayib Bukele is, but what Nayib Bukele was doing. Um, and the third and final act is the crisis of disappearances and human rights violations. Um, Here we have multiple victims. We have victims that were disappeared, like Ismael, Josue, Carlos, Karen, and Eduardo Toledo. And their stories are told by the relatives, by Yvette Toledo, the mother of Karen and Eduardo, by the mother and the father of Carlos. Um, they were all disappeared. Some of them have been found. Regretfully, they were found dead, but some others haven't been found when we were doing our reporting. And there are also another kind of victims here. This last part is where we focus a little bit more in what Brian experienced, having to flee his country and dealing with the political violence he and so many other journalists and friends of him were living. So Brian Avelar is kind of a victim here, but we put a lot of effort on not trying to victimize him. Just he was a protagonist of this story. Um, the crime here, again, there are multiple crimes. There's lack of access to justice. There's lack of presumption of innocence. There's political persecution of dissidents, among others. And the perpetrator is Nayib Bukele. Gustavo Villatoro, the Minister of Justice and Security, is in the picture behind Bukele, and multiple government officials. So we use here again, like the 3 key pieces of a true crime, but to tell a story about human rights violations, to tell the story about political power grab, um, among other things. And this structure not only help us to tell a really complex story of violence in a meaningful and engaging way. Um, it also made our documentary series show how violence is the seed of dictatorships. That's a thing that we didn't know when we were building and this story, but after we were close to finish it, I and some members of the team, like we truly believe that Humo can help people understand how Najib Bukele became a dictator and how violence is like the pretext for these politicians to grab power, and we see that through history, but in life how they did, like he's becoming a little bit authoritarian. Okay, like he's changing the constitution. He's been reelected even though it was illegal before he came to power. Now he's a dictator. So the story, our podcast series, I truly believe it helps to understand that. So that's how we build this story. It's a general and broad way of how we came up with Humo, murder, and silence in El Salvador. It's uh, it's I'm sorry, I was reading the comment. I hope it's not me. That's how we build this story in a general way. Obviously, it took a lot of people, as I said, and a lot of time and a lot of discussions, but uh, that's that's the way we build. And now, just to finish, let me talk about a little bit of the results that we obtain. I will start by the classics like in charts. Uh, I don't see freezing in my end, but
No, you're right now.
oh, thanks, sir. Um, Fer Estrada is one of our producers. Uh, in charts, we were number one in documentary on Apple Podcasts in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and that was for us a big accomplishment. Not because it's always you're always happy when you're in the top of the charts, but to make this story regional for us was very important because we share some realities in all of these countries, in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And we were top 10 in society and culture in El Salvador, Mexico, Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica. So our story resonate in Mexico and in Central America. That was our main goal. Then we also get to number 15 in documentary on Apple Podcasts in the United States. One key part of this that I didn't say, it was that we made this, Humo is also told in English by Daniel, and a journalist from El Salvador that lives in the US. He's the host of the English version, so we have an English version. Um, that was focused mainly on all the people from El Salvador that live there or are second, third generation Salvadorans that went to the United States when the dictatorship in the 80s was going in El Salvador. Um, we get to number 29 in all podcasts on Apple Podcast Mexico, number 8 in society and culture on Spotify in Mexico, and number 60 on top podcasts on Spotify in Mexico. So we get really good results the first weeks of a limited series. It's difficult. It's getting even more difficult for limited series to achieve those kind of numbers. That was in great in great way because of our marketing team. I will talk a little bit about that. Then listeners reception in the first weeks of the of after release, we got like more than 200 5 stars ratings, and we got a lot of positive feedback from on platforms and on social media. Um, as I said, we accomplished much of this because our marketing and earned media strategy. Um, what the team at Sonoro does for our limited series is securing a special promotion for series like Humo on both podcast platforms. Spotify and Apple Podcasts are the big ones here in Mexico and Central America. So we were part of the weekly recommendations of the shows. Our trailers were promoted by Apple Podcasts, and we appear in various highlights. Then the other thing that really helped us was we had 27 feed drops on Sonoro's network shows, plus one external show. That really helps. It's like one of the key ways to get a bigger audience, to go to other shows or to appear in other show feeds. Like we have most of our launches of limited series have like the first episode in different series that are in different feeds that kind of are related. So, for example, Idolo, The State, that are two crimes. There was like an obvious place to put the first episode of Humo and get more people to listen to our series. Then we have like the traditional social media strategy, including video trailers and clips of Brian Avelar sharing Humo's stories on Instagram, TikTok, and X. And we have also earned media strategy with interviews on TV, radio, and digital news outlets, mainly in Mexico and in the United States. And then last but not least, the industry reception. That's a big boost to our like convictions and the way we did this story. The industry reception was great for us. We won 3 of the major awards in podcasting around the world. We won Best Spanish Language Narrative Podcast by the TPA in the US. It was like a new category, and we were really happy that it exists. We shared the nomination with really good and really great production companies and podcasters from the Spanish-speaking world, Latin America, and Spain. But we won that recognition. We also won the best nonfiction narrative podcast by Grupo Prisa in Spain. It's probably the one of the most important prizes for podcasting in the Spanish-speaking world. And the last one, last month, we won the Premio Gabo in Audio by Fundación Gabo in Colombia. And this one is also one of the top 3 most coveted journalist awards in Spanish, in Spanish, and really in whole Latin America and Spain and Portugal, because Portuguese is also included in these awards. So we also had this big recognition for our colleagues from the podcast, the documentary, and the journalistic industries. That's all from my end. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'm open to any questions or comments that you have. Yeah, I'll try to.
No, that's okay. That's absolutely okay. Don't worry. My name is
Let
Srikanth.
let me know how.
Srikanth.
Srikanth?
Yeah, the Shri as in shrieking when you're shouting
Shri. Oh, okay.
loudly. Yeah. So first of all, congratulations on all the awards that you won. And I know Fernanda very closely, and I'm very proud of the entire team, but particularly Fernanda. She knows why. But there's a question that I want to begin with. You said that the English version was slightly different from the Spanish version, or did I hear that wrong?
Yeah, it's slightly different.
Okay, because I did listen to a couple of episodes in the English version, and one of the things that stood out to me was some of the Spanish was not translated, it was left as is. So it was kind of like a Spanglish narration. And because I don't understand Spanish, I was unable to keep track of the story after episode 3. And it constantly felt like I was missing out on some key element which may have been said, or which may have used archival tape in Spanish. Was that a conscious decision, or?
Yes, it in some parts it was due to one of the main things that we talk about when we do nonfiction series is not just the information that the tape gives you, but the emotion that the tapes gives you. So translating things and leaving that in an English generated voice was not our goal. So we try to keep the emotions. Second, it was mainly think for the Salvadorian community in the United States. So we kind of bet that they will understand most of the interviews, and then Daniel, the host, did a little bit of translating through his narration what people were saying. But yeah, mainly it was because we believe the main audience was Salvadorians in the US. So that was like a decision and a bet, mostly a decision, but a bet we did on the English version. Um, it doesn't change a lot, but it's a really big change that Brian, who is also a character in the series in a narrative way of saying it, is the host, Daniel, telling the story about Brian being a character in the series.
Okay, that kind of,
I don't know if that kind of answers.
it kind of does, but at the same time, I the because I don't know Spanish, I was unable to keep track of the story after a certain point, and I was very invested in the story until I realized that I was missing out key elements of the story. But I do realize that if it's a different narrator narrating the protagonist's story along with the story itself, it might make things a little difficult in a language. And I completely understand choosing to focus on the Salvadorian people as the audience. So kudos to you for making that choice and for sticking with it. Sorry, Nancy, I realize I should have actually let you allow me, or rather, Rodrigo, I
Sure,
think your screen
you were
is.
completely good. You're totally fine. It looks like I'm having some technical issues on my end, maybe.
Oh, don't worry. I have plenty of questions for Rodrigo. I was just noting them down as you were speaking. So is it okay if I ask you a few more questions, Rodrigo?
Yes, please.
All right. So one of the things that I do remember from back then was that Nayib Bukele was quite popular in the country of El Salvador, but also on social media. There was this entire thing about him dumping everything in Bitcoin and whatnot. So he had become this social media personality and had a sort of a positive aura on social media. Did that popularity affect the investigation and the reporting in any way?
Yes, I think it did, but not because, well, the popularity affected in reality not just the investigation, but the work by journalists in El Salvador, because it's happening in most of our countries that journalists are seen as their rivals or the villains of the reality. It's happened in the US, it's happened in Mexico, and it happened in El Salvador. But for example, in the US, like the popularity of Donald Trump is he's not as popular as Nayib Bukele. So that it affects a lot reporting, mostly of having Brian fled the country, because the victim of the disappeared, like they want to talk to journalists because they are trying to find their loved ones. So in that way, at first it didn't hurt us. When the state of the of exception began, uh, it hurt more because other journalists that were there, like Gerson and Fernando, who kept investigating in El Salvador while Brian was out of the country. Uh, Not a lot of people want to keep talking or want to criticize Bukele's government. Uh, and in like the building of a story, I'm happy that Sarah is here because she can also talk a little bit about it. We discuss a lot about how to talk about Nayib Bukele, because we have like a whole episode dedicated to Bitcoin and how was like this surf city where you can pay only with Bitcoin, and was getting with all these foreigners and migrants from the US and from Europe and from Canada. But it kind of diverted our main story. So we left out a lot about his growing popularity and Bitcoin, but like I believe so that there was at least one or two episode drafts about a whole episode talking about his popularity and Bitcoin.
Interesting. Because there's also, just like the journalists had the threat of retaliation and they had to flee the country, I believe the same might have applied to the victims, except that they may not have had the same opportunity to, leave the country or leave their homes or do anything of the sort. So how do you deal with that thin line of allowing the victims to tell their stories without, them facing sort of a retaliation from the government?
Yeah. Well, first of all, like for me and for Brian and the whole of the team, it was, first of all, you need to have a lot of empathy when reaching out to them. If they want to tell their story and how much they want to tell is up to them. In some cases, and a common theme in those communities, if you let me call that communities, is that they're not afraid of the government. Just to give you an example, there's this powerful, I believe it's in episode 5, this powerful woman. I believe it's an inspiration for many of us, called Yvette Toledo. She's the mother of Eduardo and Karen. Their siblings were disappeared, and she faced in a press conference the Minister of Justice, Villatoro. Like, she literally screams at him and tells him and asks him where are her kids. So we, if, for example, if people don't want to talk, or if they want anonymity, we gave it to them, but these people isn't afraid of anything. Like, I think that perspective of the victims, it's also like what we were always trying to share with the listeners. Like, their pain and their power, it's so big that the story needs to honor that. It also happened, for example, there's the father of Carlos was talking with gang members at night, where there's no police, where there's no security. Well, even in the day there was no security in El Salvador, but at night it was more scary. He was talking to gang members about where his son could be. So I think it's also a way of giving them the power as human beings and not just as victims, giving them the power as activists and as political dissidents, and not just as victims. If when we saw them and we take into account all these things that they've done, I think it's easier for us not to be a little bit, I don't know how to say this, like treat them with with some
Kindness in them.
inferiority. Yeah. So I think that's a very big thing we accomplished through the interviews, through the relationships that Brian built, and through the writing of the series.
Also, maybe there might have been a possibility of them throwing caution to the wind and saying, "We've already lost our loved ones. What more is there to lose?"
Yeah, I think like I recently became a father, and like if something happens to your child, it's the worst thing. So there's no more much more that could happen to you. So and you can hear them. Like that was also like coming back to your first question. Maybe that's why also we were like pretty sure to keep them in Spanish to give you that kind of emotion and power that they have when they were talking.
Hmm. Speaking of slight tangent, but when the podcast started picking up in the charts, when the series started picking up in the charts, uh, did the government sit up and take additional notice? Was there further pushback, additional retaliation, as something of the sort come your way?
From our way, no. But for example, Revista Factum, one our partner in Salvador, like has been living with that pushback and this backlash from the government since probably they began publishing. So it's it was not new in in the big context, not in our story, but in the big context on El Salvador, things got worse. Like from when we finish reporting, when we finish scripting, from when we publish, from today, things are just worse. Just to give you an example, the woman I show in this slide is Ruth Lopez. She's a human rights activist, and she was imprisoned like a month ago without any reason. She's being kept incommunicated through her lawyers, her relatives. Nobody knows anything about Ruth Lopez from more than a couple, like 4 6 weeks ago. And that happened also to another lawyer, another activist. Some political dissidents fled the country in 22, and most of them have fled the country this year. For example, El Faro, all their offices, their journalists are living in Central America because they cannot longer live in El Salvador and keep doing their work. Most of them are in Costa Rica, in Guatemala, in Mexico, but they cannot keep doing their work there. So it's gotten worse, but not directly to us. Like we have the privilege of being in Mexico. Uh, I'm talking about Sonoro, but for the reality in El Salvador, it's even worse.
Yeah, I can imagine. And not to be insensitive, but probably there's your sequel to Humo waiting, probably in her story.
Yeah, I think like for me, it's also it, I get what you say, but it's also like when it's an important question for us as storytellers, and there is my witness that I discuss with her a lot of this. When we when when you finish, like how when is the time to finish a story, and the things were getting worse and worse and worse in El Salvador, and like it's very to assemble a team of more than 30 people to work in a podcast, it's really difficult. Like keep doing that, it's really difficult. But yeah, there's probably a sequel of Humo, and also there's a lot of stories from El Salvador that are needed right now via podcast, through news reports, through documentaries, through fictions, like because it's for that this is totally personal. For me, it's like a warning sign for for most of our countries in Latin America, in the whole continent, about how if violence isn't solved in like democratic and legal and with the judicial system, it's an open opportunity for someone like Nayib Bukele, and the consequences are really felt in all of these people like Ruth and like Brian and
Yeah.
the journalist from El Faro.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'll be candid. I'm slightly more invested because some of the behaviors that you've described of the government are also being seen here in India, where a lot of important free speech is being clamped down on very quietly and very surreptitiously. There have been a couple of cases here in India where uh, where outspoken dissidents have been arrested on pretenses that are very flimsy, and they've been behind bars for a year, 2 years. Some of them have sadly, unfortunately, passed away in the interim, because we've had a government that hasn't changed since 2014. We are right now in the 11th year, and this is expected to go on till 2025. And the signs are all pointing towards a subtle shift towards authoritarianism, some soft fascism kind of a scenario. But we keep hoping that things will change. But if they do not, then some of us will have to stand up and create stories like these, where we also sort of unwrap what is happening and hope that there are enough people sitting up to take notice. One last question that I would like to ask you has to do with sorry, let me just quickly yeah, was there, because you said you chose the perspective of the victims to focus the narration, the storyline, uh, was there a point where some of the story or some aspect of the story may have been lost out on because you couldn't narrate that using a third person narrator who could probably tie those stories together?
Mm, from like right now, I don't think so. We have that problem. Um, as I said, we mainly left out the killer's perspective because we have a lot of information about his crimes, uh, but not a lot about the victims, because one of the things that happens in the story is that it doesn't start with Brian being the main character. He becomes, through the process of investigating and through the reality of El Salvador, he becomes a big character. So from the start, you listen to Brian as a traditional reporter, talking with these victims and going to these places and finding out new pieces of information. Um, it also, we believe that it also helps us to build him as a character in the narration structure, to get to know him, to get to know why he was doing this job and how he was doing this job, and I believe like the sensibility which Brian approaches the people he interviews, and the sensitivity where he and Fernanda and Sarah and the rest of the team translated those interviews in the scripts, um, make us didn't feel like you always lose some kind of information, but not anything that was deliberately needed to cut in order to have Brian as a character.
The
If
integrity of the story is maintained
yeah,
without
totally,
justification.
like yes.
Right. Those were my questions. I won't pester you anymore. It was great
No,
hearing the
thank you.
process come
Thank you for
together.
asking.
Entirely my pleasure. Thank you so much for responding so patiently, and thank you, Fernanda.
Any last
Nancy, over to you.
any last questions? If not, Rodrigo, thank you so much for your time, and for allowing us to hear all about your podcast. It was very informative.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to giving this space to a podcast in mainly in Spanish. So I think it's very rich to learn like what's happening in India and what's happening in other countries. So thank you for this space to share a little bit of what we did with Humo.
No,
Honestly, the
absolutely.
next step is to create a video series for Netflix or Amazon Prime or one of the platforms. Think about it.
We'll start pitching it.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you, Nancy.
Congrats, guys. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.